Hello, my dear friends. Beneath the statues of muscular gods and wise philosophers, ancient Greece hid a truth few wanted to mention. Female bodies were not meant to live, but to be controlled. No freedom, no voice, and no choice. They were turned into tools for lust, for punishment, for art, and even for politics. What you think is noble is actually built on pain that no one is allowed to speak about. Tonight, you will join us in tracing every trace of that silence and realize what history has deliberately forgotten. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to listen only to the praises sung about freedom in ancient Greece, it would seem like a society where every individual could act according to their will. The philosophers spoke of liberty, the poets described beauty as the highest virtue, and the sculptors carved human bodies as symbols of perfection. Yet within this same world, women lived under strict control, their bodies not their own, their choices shaped by men who claimed to honour ideals while denying them to half the population. This contradiction lay at the very heart of Greek culture, accepted without protest, even celebrated as the natural order of things. In Athens, men gathered in the agora to discuss politics and philosophy. They spoke freely of justice, democracy, and reason, while their wives remained in locked rooms at home. Public life was a privilege of men, and so was sexual liberty. A man could take lovers, could enjoy companionship with courtesans, could even participate openly in relationships with younger males. For him, the range of choices was wide, unrestricted by shame or law. For women, the reality was the opposite. Every glance, every gesture, every rumour about impropriety could tarnish not only their reputation, but also the honour of their entire family. The contradiction was sharpened by the way Greek culture valued appearances. Statues of Aphrodite displayed the female body in full beauty, yet real women were denied the right to display even the smallest part of themselves without consequence. The female form was praised as art, but the female person was denied agency. While men celebrated freedom in public speeches, they guarded women's bedrooms with suspicion. To them, liberty was a male possession, not a universal right. It is almost absurd to imagine a society that spoke of democracy, but built its foundation on such inequality. One might say the Greeks invented the art of preaching freedom while practicing control. The tension between ideals and daily life became part of their identity. Citizens could boast of creating a culture that valued open debate, while ignoring the silence forced upon their wives and daughters. The sharpness of this contrast can be seen in how sexuality was divided. Men were encouraged to explore desire, to treat it as an expression of strength and education. Women, on the other hand, were bound to the notion of chastity, their worth measured by obedience and purity. A man could be seen as honourable after countless affairs, but a woman might lose everything after a single whisper of misconduct. The freedom men enjoyed became a kind of power, while the restrictions on women became chains that bound them to the household. For many families, the daughter was a symbol of family reputation more than an individual. Her movements were limited, her company chosen, her speech moderated. Fathers and husbands saw themselves as guardians, though in truth they were jailers. Control was framed as protection, and women were expected to accept it without question. A girl's future was decided long before she could speak of desire, marriage, motherhood, and silence defined her role, while choice and passion belonged to men. When one imagines the crowded streets of Athens or Corinth, with men arguing politics in the open air, it is important to remember that half the population was missing from this picture. Women's voices were absent not because they lacked thoughts, but because society kept them confined. Their exclusion was seen as natural, not oppressive, just as the mint candy in Victorian markets looked pure but hid poison. Greek liberty looked universal but was poisoned by exclusion. The hypocrisy feels strangely familiar, since even modern societies often preach equality while leaving invisible barriers in place. Inside homes, the separation was absolute. Women were kept in their own quarters, sometimes literally locked away, while men entertained guests and companions freely. This physical divide mirrored the moral divide. Men's bodies were public, open to pleasure, politics, and philosophy. Women's bodies were private property, guarded and exchanged through marriage contracts. The contradiction was not hidden. It was openly practiced, and yet no one questioned it. To question it would be to question the very structure of society. The cultural acceptance of this double standard made it stable, even respectable. Plays and poetry celebrated male passion, while female desire was ignored or condemned. Religion reinforced the same message, with goddesses admired for beauty but rarely for autonomy. The system survived not through silence alone but through ritual and law, weaving inequality into the very fabric of Greek identity. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining how normal this must have felt to them. A world where freedom was praised daily but granted only to one gender. The grandeur of Greek achievements, democracy, art, and philosophy shines brightly in history. Yet when looked at closely, that brilliance casts long shadows. The lives of women, hidden and restricted, reveal a darker truth behind the marble facades. A culture that called itself the cradle of liberty was also a cage for half its people. The contradiction of liberty and control was not seen as contradiction at all. To the men who defined society, it was simply natural. Women were possessions, guardians of family honour, symbols of chastity, and nothing more. To give them choice would have threatened the very ideals that men believed they embodied. The structure held firm because no one allowed themselves to imagine another way. The Greek world thus reveals a strange paradox, a civilization admired for freedom, yet built on control, a culture that celebrated beauty, yet denied beauty its voice, a society remembered for its wisdom, yet blind to its own injustice. This paradox would echo through every aspect of Greek life, shaping how sexuality, morality, and honour were understood. The story of Greek liberty reveals how freedom and control existed side by side. From this foundation, the differences in how young men and women were taught about sexuality emerge clearly. What was celebrated as education for boys would become chains for girls, and that contrast opens the door to a far more unsettling truth. Young men in Greece were raised with the understanding that sexuality was part of their education, not something to be hidden. From an early age, boys were taught to see desire as a natural element of life, woven into the lessons given by older men who acted as guides and mentors. This practice, known as pederasty, was accepted not as a scandal, but as a method of shaping character and intellect. The idea was that a young boy learned discipline, bravery, and wisdom while also being introduced to physical intimacy. To Greeks, this was not a contradiction. It was a system where morality and desire were bound together, and it made sense to them that a boy's path to adulthood passed through such relationships. In many city-states, especially Athens, these arrangements were openly acknowledged. A respected citizen could take on the role of a mentor, spending time with a younger boy, offering him lessons in politics, philosophy, and sexuality. Society viewed this as a way of building bonds between generations. For the young, it was both a privilege and a burden. The boy gained protection and status, but also became the object of desire. It was a system created by men, for men, where boys were moulded into future citizens through a mix of learning and intimacy. The acceptance of male same-sex relations stood in sharp contrast to the silence surrounding female desire. While men could pursue these connections without shame, Women were left out of the picture entirely. The cultural logic was simple. A man's body could be a site of learning, while a woman's body had to remain guarded. It is almost ironic that a society obsessed with controlling female sexuality openly celebrated the sexual education of boys. This reveals how deeply unequal the rules were, though few at the time would have seen it that way. Scenes painted on pottery or carved into stone often showed older men and younger boys together, a reflection of what was normalized. These images were not hidden in private spaces but displayed in households, temples, and workshops. To the Greeks, this was not pornography, but culture. They believed these relationships symbolized strength, teaching, and beauty. Desire between men was elevated into art, while desire between women or even women's voices about their own bodies were erased. If we compared this to today, it would be like schools officially encouraging relationships between teenagers and their mentors, treating them as natural steps in education. The idea feels disturbing to us now, but it was built into the very structure of Greek society. The mentorship model also reinforced hierarchy. The older man was the active figure, the teacher and guide, while the boy was passive, expected to receive and learn. This mirrored how adult men later treated women as beings to be controlled, instructed, and possessed. By normalizing passivity in youth, the culture trained men to value dominance in adulthood. The transition from boy to man included shifting from being the one acted upon to the one who acted. In this sense, sexuality became a training ground for power. Religious and civic rituals even acknowledged these bonds. Festivals sometimes celebrated male beauty, and poetry praised the love of an older man for a younger one as noble and elevating. It was described as love that could inspire courage in battle and loyalty in politics. Women were not included in these ideals. Their exclusion only made the divide sharper, showing that freedom in Greece was always marked by gender. I find it unsettling to realize that what was once praised as a noble education for boys also reveals a society comfortable with deep inequalities and silence around women. The public nature of this practice meant that few questioned it. Fathers often approved of these arrangements if the older man was respected, since it meant their sons gained protection and connections. The boys themselves had little choice, though later, when grown, they might repeat the cycle with another generation. It was a tradition that maintained itself by appearing useful, moral, and even beautiful, despite the imbalance at its core. The Greeks believed that desire could be channeled into greatness. To them, the love between men had the power to create harmony in society, to bind soldiers on the battlefield, and to pass down wisdom. What it also did was normalize a double standard. Male bodies could be shared, spoken of, and celebrated, while female bodies remained locked away. This division defined Greek sexuality and reinforced the idea that freedom was a male privilege. Looking back, it is impossible to separate the achievements of Greek culture from these intimate practices. The same society that produced philosophy and democracy also believed that young boys should be shaped through physical relationships with their elders. It was not hidden, it was not forbidden, and it was not shameful to them. It was an accepted part of life, one that revealed how power and desire were entwined in the Greek world. The practice of pederasty shows how boys were trained to see sexuality as part of their education. From this point, the expectations placed on women become even more stark by contrast. What men learned as freedom would later become the source of silence and confinement for women, a truth that reshaped every part of their lives. For women in ancient Greece, sexuality was never treated as a natural part of growth. It was tied directly to honour, not only for the woman herself but for her entire family. Virginity before marriage was considered essential, and its loss outside of wedlock brought disgrace that spread beyond the individual. A girl's body was seen as the property of her household, a fragile vessel that carried the reputation of her parents and would later be handed over to her husband. Any hint of impropriety, even a rumour or a glance judged too bold, was enough to mark her as unworthy. Daily life for these women was shaped by caution. Their clothes covered them, their movements were watched, and their social circles were restricted, unlike boys, who could wander, learn, and explore. Girls lived in confinement. Their value was measured in silence and restraint. It is almost laughable that while men boasted of freedom and adventure, they treated female dignity as something so fragile that a single misstep could ruin an entire household. The contrast made the double standard clear to anyone willing to see it, though society did not allow open criticism. The importance of chastity meant that women were kept under close watch. In some households, separate quarters were built to isolate them from male visitors. Relatives acted as guardians, controlling who they met and how they spent their time. The smallest act, like speaking too freely or laughing too loudly, might be interpreted as immodest. These restrictions were accepted as natural, a way to protect family honour, though in reality they functioned as tools of control. If we compared this to today, it would be like forcing young girls to live under constant surveillance, judged at every step by how well they preserve a reputation rather than by their talents or choices. Marriage made this link between sexuality and honour even clearer. A bride's virginity was often a condition of the arrangement, with families negotiating alliances based on purity. A woman's future depended less on her personality or skills than on her ability to remain untouched. Any suspicion of intimacy outside marriage could end negotiations or destroy established ties. Men, meanwhile, faced no such barriers. Their affairs were ignored, excused, or even admired, while women faced ruin for far less. This unequal burden also meant that women carried responsibility for the family's reputation. If something went wrong, it was rarely the fault of the man involved. Blame settled on the woman, whether she acted willingly or not. Her body was viewed as the line between honour and disgrace, while men moved freely, unmarked by similar scrutiny. The same society that celebrated male pleasure condemned female desire as dangerous. In literature and drama, women who sought their own path were often punished with tragedy. Their stories warned others of the cost of defying norms. The obsession with female chastity reflected deeper fears about control. Men feared disorder, dishonour, and loss of status, and controlling women's sexuality was seen as a solution. By tying female value to purity, society created a system where women were bound by silence and caution from childhood to death. Their worth was reduced to what they did not do, rather than what they achieved. I find it troubling to imagine a world where a girl's entire future could be broken by suspicion alone, leaving her powerless to defend herself. Despite these restrictions, appearances mattered most. As long as women presented an image of modesty, families could claim honour. Behind closed doors, realities might differ, but secrecy preserved reputation. This emphasis on image over truth created a culture where fear governed behaviour. The cost was heavy, as many women lived with constant anxiety, knowing their fate rested on how others perceived them. The contradiction grew sharper when compared to men's lives. Men were free to explore, experiment, and boast of their experiences, while women bore the opposite expectation. This imbalance shaped the whole society, reinforcing the idea that men deserved liberty and women existed to guard honour. It was not hidden, not questioned, and not seen as unfair. It was considered the natural order of things. To us, the rules may appear cruel, but they were accepted as ordinary then. Girls grew up learning silence, modesty, and obedience as virtues. Families prized daughters who kept to themselves, who avoided attention, who lived almost invisibly until marriage. To be seen was to risk shame. To speak was to risk suspicion. This pattern created generations of women who lived in the shadows of their fathers and husbands, never owning their own stories. Female sexuality in ancient Greece was thus less about desire and more about duty. It served as a measure of family standing, a tool of alliance, and a fragile commodity that could not be risked. Women's bodies were not their own, and their honour was never in their hands. The society that celebrated beauty and art treated living women as symbols, stripped of autonomy, and defined only by restraint. The control of female chastity reveals the stark divide between ideals and reality. Greece may be remembered for democracy and freedom, but for women, those words carried no weight. Their lives were marked by silence, their choices erased before they were even imagined. This system endured because it was woven into every aspect of culture, from law to literature, from home to temple. Female honour became a mirror of male pride, and that connection shaped how society viewed both genders. The obsession with purity may have looked like protection, but in truth, it was control. Women were praised when they remained invisible, punished when they stepped beyond the line, and remembered only when they embodied tragedy. The story of women's chastity shows how a family's reputation was balanced on the silence of its daughters. From this silence grew a world where men defined freedom while women carried burdens they did not choose. What was denied to women would soon reveal another contradiction, where marriage itself became less about love and more about duty, leaving intimacy to be sought elsewhere. Marriage in ancient Greece was less a union of affection than a contract designed to ensure the continuation of the household. A wife was chosen carefully, her value measured by family ties and reputation, not by passion or intimacy. Once married, she was expected to bear children and manage the domestic sphere, fulfilling her role quietly and without complaint. To her husband, she was respected in name, but rarely treated as a companion in love. For many men, their wives were symbols of stability rather than sources of pleasure. The reality was that intimacy and desire often existed outside the marriage bond. Men kept courtesans, concubines, or household servants to satisfy their appetites, hetairai. Educated companions who could converse on philosophy and politics were especially valued for their wit as well as their bodies. These relationships were openly acknowledged, and society did not treat them as scandalous. The wife remained the mother of legitimate heirs, while pleasure was found elsewhere. It is almost comical that a husband could keep several companions without shame, yet expected his wife to embody purity and silence. The rules were never equal, and everyone knew it. Inside the home, the contrast was sharp. The wife moved within her designated quarters, caring for children, managing servants, weaving cloth, and maintaining the household. The husband, meanwhile, entertained guests, joined symposia, and sought companionship outside. What bound them together was not affection but duty. Their lives intersected around lineage, not romance. If we compare this arrangement to the modern world, it would be as if marriage licenses were issued only to guarantee heirs, while affection and intimacy were assumed to belong entirely to other relationships. Such a notion feels alien today, yet it was the accepted order of things then. This separation between marriage and desire reveals how the Greeks divided life into categories. The wife belonged to the realm of duty, the courtesan to the realm of pleasure. The two did not overlap. A woman who bore children might never know intimacy with her own husband, while he enjoyed freedoms denied to her. These divisions reinforced the idea that women's value lay in service, while men's value lay in conquest. The arrangement also reflected economic and social interests. Marriage was a tool for forming alliances between families, ensuring inheritance, and securing property. Love or attraction played no role in these calculations. A girl could be married off in her teens to a much older man, chosen not for compatibility but for advantage. She had little say, and once married, her role was locked. Her husband might be affectionate in public words, but his real desires were often expressed elsewhere. I find it unsettling to imagine a household where a wife's role was reduced to childbearing, while her husband openly sought fulfillment in the arms of others. This division was normalized by law and custom. Men faced no stigma for keeping companions, provided they fulfilled their responsibilities as husbands and fathers. Women, by contrast, risked everything for the slightest suggestion of impropriety. The imbalance was clear, yet no one challenged it. It was presented as practical, natural, and even moral. The wife carried the weight of legitimacy, while desire became the privilege of her husband alone. In the wider society, these practices were reflected in art and literature. Plays often depicted wives as silent figures in the background, while hetairai were given voices, wit, and complexity. Men wrote poetry to their lovers, but rarely to their wives. This silence reinforced the invisibility of wives beyond their role as mothers. The culture celebrated pleasure, but only when it was separated from marriage. The consequences of this system shaped women's lives profoundly. Many wives lived isolated, without companionship, reduced to functions rather than partners. Their sense of self was limited to their duties, while the emotional and physical aspects of marriage were denied them. For men, this arrangement created a world of double privilege heirs at home and freedom in the city. It was a structure that benefited them at every level, sustained by tradition and reinforced by law. Looking back, the Greek model of marriage reveals a society that openly divided human experience. Love and duty were placed in separate boxes, with women expected to embody the latter. Men navigated both worlds freely, but women remained bound. This double life reflected the larger contradiction of Greek culture liberty for some, confinement for others. The marriage bond in Greece was therefore both central and hollow. It anchored society, inheritance, and reputation, yet it lacked intimacy for many women trapped inside it. Husbands looked elsewhere, wives endured silence, and society continued unchanged. The system held because it suited those in power and silenced those without it. The story of Greek marriage shows how duty and desire were carefully separated, leaving wives with a responsibility but no freedom. From this divide, another unique group of women emerged, companions who were permitted to step outside the silence, educated and bold, yet still vulnerable. Their presence offered contrast to wives, and their lives reveal the fragile exceptions in a rigid system. The hetairai of ancient Greece occupied a place unlike any other women in their society. While wives were confined to the household and ordinary prostitutes were dismissed as mere tools for pleasure, hetairai stood in between, visible and respected in ways that made them both extraordinary and precarious. These women were trained in conversation, educated in music and literature, and often capable of engaging philosophers and politicians in intellectual debate. They dressed with care, they moved through public spaces, and unlike respectable wives, they were allowed to be seen. Their lives were built not on silence, but on presence, and for that reason, they became both admired and envied. Unlike ordinary women who were judged solely by chastity, hetairai were valued for their wit and skill in companionship. Men sought them not just for intimacy but for dialogue, for the rare chance to be challenged by a female voice. A symposium might include wine, music, and discussion, and it was the hetairai who animated these gatherings. They could speak freely, they could laugh openly, and they could influence those around them. This visibility was powerful but also dangerous. Society granted them freedom only within limits, and any attempt to move beyond those limits reminded them of their fragile position. Their existence highlighted the contradictions of Greek culture. On one hand, hetairai were celebrated, painted, and praised for their talents. On the other hand, they were excluded from the possibility of marriage, denied the respect of being legitimate wives, and kept at a distance from inheritance and stability. They were women of learning and independence, yet society refused to give them permanence. It is almost absurd that the only women permitted to speak freely were those denied the possibility of being seen as honourable in the eyes of the law. The precariousness of their role meant that their survival depended on reputation. A hetairai had to balance allure with intelligence, charm with discretion. Too much boldness risked alienating patrons, while too much dependence risked obscurity. They were both celebrated and vulnerable, walking a thin line between admiration and ruin. Many were supported by wealthy men. But this support could vanish quickly, leaving them exposed. Unlike wives, who were bound by law, hetairai had no protections when abandoned. Their fame could make them rich, but it could also make them targets. The very qualities that set them apart also revealed society's fears. Greek men valued them because they could offer conversation, insight, and stimulation that wives could not. Yet these qualities also reminded men of what was denied to their wives and daughters. The cultural order relied on silence in the household, so it had to keep the hetairai outside of it. Their independence was tolerated as long as it was useful, but never allowed to challenge the structure of marriage and family. If we compare this to today, it would be like a society where women are allowed to be successful public figures only if they agree never to marry, never to bear legitimate children, and never to cross into the realm of traditional respectability. Hetairai sometimes wielded significant influence, particularly with men in positions of power. They could advise, inspire, and even shape decisions through their closeness to statesmen and generals. Yet their voices were always informal, never official. They remained outside the structures of law and politics, their power indirect. For every celebrated hetairai, countless others disappeared into poverty once beauty faded, or patrons withdrew. Their brilliance was temporary by design, tolerated only while it entertained and flattered male ambition. In literature and art, hetairai were depicted with fascination. They were portrayed as witty, beautiful, and elusive, often standing as contrast to silent wives. The popularity of these depictions showed how deeply Greek men desired female companionship that went beyond obedience. Yet the very act of idealizing them confirmed their separation from ordinary women. They were imagined as extraordinary beings precisely because ordinary women were denied these qualities. Society admired what it forbade elsewhere, creating a strange paradox where the female voice was both craved and censured. Their position also revealed how class shaped sexuality. Ordinary prostitutes were plentiful but ignored, their lives marked by hardship and invisibility. Wives were respected but silenced. Hetairai, by contrast, were elevated as symbols of refinement, but only because they served elite men. Their independence was limited to the boundaries of male interest. Once they were no longer desirable, society had no use for them. I find it deeply unsettling that the only path for a woman to speak freely and live outside confinement was to embrace a life that society ultimately refused to honour. The existence of hetairai did not challenge the double standards of Greece. Rather, it reinforced them. Their fame suggested that exceptions were possible, but those exceptions depended on exclusion from legitimacy. They were the bright ornaments of a system that kept most women invisible. In admiring them, Greek men confirmed that other women would never be allowed the same freedom. When we examine their lives, we see both freedom and fragility intertwined. Hetairai showed that women could be intelligent, eloquent, and influential. But their exclusion from lawful marriage and family proved that true equality was never intended. They lived in a space that society created to enjoy without ever being acknowledged as equals. Their brilliance illuminated the limits of Greek liberty, reminding us that admiration without rights is another form of control. The story of the hetairai reveals how society permitted a narrow group of women to embody freedom, while ensuring that freedom remained unsafe and incomplete. From this exception, the broader rules of male privilege become even clearer. What men enjoyed without question, women received only under conditions that denied permanence, a reality that shaped every aspect of Greek sexual culture. The hetairai stood as both symbols of independence and proof of its impossibility. Their lives reflected a culture eager to enjoy female intelligence and beauty, but terrified of granting women real authority. They remind us that freedom without stability is only another form of confinement, dressed in brighter clothes. The role of the hetairai shows how women could step briefly into visibility, yet never escape the fragility of their position. From here, the absence of restraints on men becomes sharper, revealing how male sexuality was granted a kind of immunity from judgment. What society denied to women entirely, it excused and even praised when practiced by men, creating a world of freedom for one gender and silence for the other. For men in ancient Greece, chastity was not a concept that held weight, unlike women, who were judged and confined by their purity. Men moved through society with the assurance that their desires were natural and unquestioned. A young man could take lovers before marriage, he could continue affairs after marriage, and he could form bonds with both men and women without damaging his reputation. This freedom was not considered scandalous, but rather the expression of male strength and vitality. To be active, to seek pleasure, and to conquer in love as in war was expected. The absence of restrictions created an imbalance that shaped the whole society. Where women's worth was tied to silence and control, men's worth expanded with each liaison. Male experience was praised, their affairs celebrated, and their reputation strengthened by conquest. The double standard was absolute. It is almost laughable that a man could earn admiration for the very behaviour that would destroy a woman's life entirely. This unequal scale was not hidden, it was enshrined in law, in custom, and in everyday practice. For many men, sexuality was a marker of status. Relationships with courtesans, encounters with slaves, and bonds with young protégés were all accepted avenues. A man's liberty in this regard was seen as proof of his authority, his independence, and his right to rule his household. The expectation was not that he would abstain, but that he would act, that he would claim what he wanted. If we compare this to the modern world, it would be as if society celebrated men who broke every promise of fidelity, while condemning women for the smallest rumour of impropriety. Such hypocrisy was deeply embedded in Greek life, sustained by the belief that men embodied reason while women embodied weakness. This freedom was justified as natural. Philosophers and writers described male desire as inevitable, a force to be channeled rather than restricted. Laws reflected this attitude by turning a blind eye to men's affairs while punishing women's indiscretions harshly. Society treated male sexuality as a resource, not a danger, while female sexuality was seen as a threat to honour. The result was a culture where pleasure for men was a right, but for women it was a crime. The impact on marriage was profound. Husbands expected obedience from wives while allowing themselves indulgence elsewhere. A man's infidelity was not grounds for disgrace, and often not even for discussion. His wife remained bound to silence, while he carried on with courtesans or slaves without fear of consequence. To the outside world, this was ordinary, another feature of a system designed to protect male privilege. Young men were encouraged to explore, to prove themselves, and to gain experience before settling into household duties. Their adventures were seen as preparation for adulthood. The expectation was that a man who had known desire in many forms would become a stronger leader, a more capable citizen. Women received no such education. Their path was silence, and their worth was measured by what they had not done. The divide was total, shaping the future of both genders from their earliest years. Even in literature, the celebration of male freedom was clear. Male heroes were praised for their lovers, their conquests, and their indulgence. Female figures, in contrast, were punished for expressing desire. The same society that admired Achilles for his passion condemned Medea for hers. This mirrored the broader world liberty was framed as male, while restraint was imposed on women. I find it disturbing to think how natural this must have seemed. A world where one gender could indulge endlessly, while the other was ruined by suspicion alone. The cultural acceptance of male freedom extended into religion and ritual as well. Festivals celebrated fertility, virility, and male strength. Priests and poets praised the vigour of men, while women were cast as symbols of purity or danger. These contrasts reinforced the belief that the sexes existed in separate moral worlds. Men could wander between desire and duty, but women were trapped on one side of the line. The imbalance created patterns that lasted for centuries. By excusing men and condemning women, society locked inequality into its foundation. Every household, every marriage, every ritual repeated the same message: liberty for men, silence for women. This message was not questioned because it appeared natural. Men's freedom was equated with strength, women's restriction with morality. The culture celebrated one while demanding the other, never seeing the contradiction. In daily life, this meant that men enjoyed a flexibility that women could not imagine. They could choose lovers, seek out courtesans, or build bonds with protégés without consequence. Women, meanwhile, lived under constant scrutiny, their futures tied to reputation. This divide was accepted so completely that it became invisible to those living within it. The injustice only becomes clear when we look back and measure the differences. Male liberty in Greece shows how double standards were not hidden, but embraced. The society that praised freedom made it a gendered privilege, denying half its population the very rights it claimed to value. Men were celebrated for desire, women were condemned for the same. This contradiction reveals the limits of Greek ideals and the fragility of their claims to liberty. The story of male chastity, or rather its absence, demonstrates how freedom was defined as a male possession. From here, the strict control of female virginity appears in even sharper contrast. What men were allowed without thought became the very thing that determined women's fate. Creating a world where honour was split by gender and inequality was embedded in every household. From childhood, Greek girls were taught that their bodies did not belong to them but to the honour of their families. Every step, every word, every gesture was observed by parents and guardians who believed that purity was a treasure to be guarded at all costs. A daughter's virginity was more than a personal condition. It was considered the spiritual dowry that her father would one day present to a husband. A girl might grow up surrounded by brothers who roamed freely, yet her own life was restricted to a few rooms inside the household. She was a living symbol of her family's reputation, and her freedom was exchanged for honour. The physical environment reflected this obsession. Women's quarters were often separated from the spaces where men gathered. These rooms could be locked, and visitors were carefully controlled. A girl's privacy was not her own, but her family's method of surveillance. While men met openly in the agora, women learned to live in the shadows of their homes. They were not hidden because they lacked value, but because their value was measured by absence. It is almost ridiculous that a society could celebrate the perfection of the female body in statues while locking away the real women behind closed doors. The rules of seclusion were presented as protection. Parents claimed they were safeguarding their daughters from danger. In truth, these restrictions served to guard family honour. The daughter's behaviour determined the respectability of her father, her brothers, and her future husband. If she was suspected of impropriety, the entire household could be disgraced. Her worth was therefore not her own to manage. She carried the weight of her family's reputation without consent. If we compared this to today, it would be like locking teenage girls in their bedrooms to ensure they never interacted with outsiders, treating their innocence as a form of currency. This system left young women with little agency. From childhood to marriage, they were passed from father to husband, never experiencing ownership of themselves. Even friendships were restricted. Their company was carefully chosen, and their movements were watched. Festivals and rituals that included women were exceptions, not freedoms. These rare moments of visibility did not erase the constant confinement of their daily lives. For fathers, protecting a daughter's virginity was an investment. A pure daughter could secure a favourable marriage, which meant alliances, wealth, or political advantage. Her body became a bargaining tool in negotiations between families. Her silence and her chastity were treated as assets to be exchanged. This turned her existence into a commodity, where her value was fixed long before she could decide anything for herself. I cannot help but feel disturbed by the idea that a young girl's life was measured not by her mind or her spirit, but by the suspicion that she had remained untouched. The enforcement of these rules was not only physical but also cultural. Stories, plays, and traditions emphasized the dangers of female sexuality. Tragedies often portrayed women who stepped outside these boundaries as destructive, while men who pursued freedom were praised. Religion reinforced this separation, casting goddesses as ideals of chastity or as dangerous figures when they represented desire. Ordinary women were left with no models of freedom, only warnings of what would happen if they crossed the line. The contradiction became clearer in the daily lives of families. A father could spend time at the symposium, enjoying conversation and companionship with hetairai, while his daughter remained locked in her quarters. The household itself symbolized this divide. Public rooms were open, full of voices, while female spaces were silent and guarded. The architecture of the home reflected the architecture of inequality. This culture of control did not end with childhood. Even after marriage, a woman's purity remained tied to her husband's honor. Her virginity was no longer her father's asset but her husband's claim. The transfer of control from one man to another left no space for female autonomy. Women lived within a cycle where their most personal aspect became the possession of others. Looking back, the obsession with virginity reveals how deeply patriarchal the Greek system was. Virginity was not treated as a personal state, but as a collective property. Families believed they were protecting their daughters, but in truth, they were controlling them to serve broader social interests. This created a culture where female identity was bound to silence, absence, and restraint. The cruelty of this system lies in its normalization. Families did not view their actions as oppressive. They saw them as necessary and moral. The silence of women reinforced the illusion that this order was natural. Because girls rarely had a voice, no one considered what they might have wanted. Society thrived on their absence, building freedom for men on the foundation of female confinement. The story of guarded virginity also shows how inequality perpetuates itself. By locking away girls, families taught each new generation that women's worth was tied to purity. Boys grew up seeing their sisters restricted while they themselves enjoyed freedom, and they carried this lesson into adulthood. The system replicated itself without resistance because it was hidden inside the daily life of every home. Virginity was transformed into a commodity, but also into a symbol of power for men. Fathers could use it to negotiate alliances, and husbands could claim it as proof of possession. Women had no voice in these transactions. They were present only as silent figures whose worth was defined by what they had not done. The obsession with female virginity shows how Greek families treated their daughters as guardians of honor rather than as individuals. From this practice came a system that punished women harshly for any breach while excusing men completely. The freedom that men enjoyed was visible precisely because women's confinement was so absolute. The culture of confinement made female virginity the property of others, a fragile possession that determined the fate of whole families. From this point, the laws of Greece appear in sharper focus, revealing how even the courts enforced these unequal rules. What families practiced privately was mirrored publicly, creating a complete system of inequality that no woman could escape. In ancient Greece, the weight of the law fell unevenly when it came to matters of sexuality. A woman accused of adultery faced severe consequences. She could be expelled from her home, stripped of her rights, and left without protection. Her reputation was destroyed instantly, and with it her place in society. The punishment was not only personal but total. Her dishonor extended to her family, marking them with disgrace. For her, there was no path to forgiveness or restoration. Adultery was treated as the ultimate betrayal, yet only when committed by women. Men lived under no such burden. A husband might sleep with slaves, visit brothels, or maintain relationships with hetairai, and the law had nothing to say about it. These acts were not classified as betrayal, nor were they considered damaging to the household. To society, a man's sexual life was his own to manage, limited only by his ability to avoid scandal. It is almost laughable that the same society capable of writing laws about honour could pretend not to notice when men indulged in every possible affair. The double standard was not hidden, but enshrined in custom and reinforced by courts. Legal cases reflected this imbalance clearly. Court speeches from Athens describe men defending their households by expelling unfaithful wives, often with support from juries who viewed such actions as necessary. The law did not ask for proof of coercion, nor did it distinguish between desire and circumstance. A woman's guilt was assumed the moment suspicion arose. Men, on the other hand, could admit openly to visiting prostitutes without fear of penalty. What mattered was not fidelity itself, but the preservation of male dignity. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like a legal system where a woman could lose her home and citizenship for a rumour of infidelity, while a man could boast about his affairs in court and walk away applauded. This inequality was rooted in the idea that a woman's body belonged to her household. Adultery was framed as theft, not of affection, but of property. A wife who strayed was accused of endangering inheritance, polluting the bloodline, and damaging her husband's control. The courts treated her as a liability to the family's honour. Men's infidelity posed no such risk because their actions did not threaten lineage. Slaves and prostitutes were considered outside the boundaries of legitimacy, so their involvement with men carried no consequences. The harshness of these laws created a culture of fear. Women lived with the knowledge that suspicion alone could end their security. A husband's word could turn into a sentence, and there was a little chance of defence. The imbalance of power was obvious. Men controlled the accusations, the property, and the outcome. Women carried the burden, silenced by a system that treated their bodies as possessions. I find it disturbing to imagine a society where courts claimed to uphold justice, while functioning mainly to secure male pride. Punishment for women was not only legal, but also social. A disgraced wife might be cast out, forced into poverty, or even sold into slavery if her husband chose. Families distanced themselves to protect their own honour, leaving her without allies. Meanwhile, the man involved with her could often escape without penalty, facing little more than gossip. The imbalance was not accidental. It reflected a system designed to reinforce male control. Court cases also revealed the performative nature of these accusations. Lawyers emphasized shame, dishonour, and the corruption of family order, appealing to jurors' sense of male pride. The woman's voice was rarely heard. Even when she appeared, it was as an object of discussion rather than as an active participant. She was spoken about, never allowed to speak for herself. The silence of women in the courtroom mirrored the silence of women in society. The absence of fairness is striking. The same society that prided itself on inventing democracy excluded women from its benefits entirely. Laws about adultery were not about equality, but about protecting male dominance. Justice was framed through the lens of ownership, where the greatest concern was inheritance and property, not the rights of individuals. The courtroom became another stage where inequality was rehearsed and confirmed. The imbalance also reinforced cultural attitudes. Boys grew up seeing their mothers and sisters restricted, while hearing men boast of their liberties. They learned that the law was a tool for preserving male privilege, not for creating balance. This shaped their understanding of power, embedding inequality into each generation. By punishing women harshly while excusing men, the courts turned inequality into tradition. The entire system reveals how justice was twisted into protection for one gender. Women were controlled through fear, while men were excused through custom. This double standard was not only tolerated but expected. A society that could write philosophy about virtue and governance somehow accepted that half its population had no rights to defend. The contradiction between ideals and reality is stark, and it reveals the limits of Greek morality. The treatment of adultery in Greek courts shows how law reinforced inequality rather than correcting it. From these trials, we see clearly that what mattered was not justice, but the preservation of male dignity. Women bore the full weight of punishment while men walked free. This pattern shaped every part of Greek life, extending the silence of women from the home into the courtroom itself. The laws of adultery demonstrate how deeply male privilege was embedded in Greek society. From here, the cultural condemnation of female desire becomes even clearer. What men were allowed to enjoy openly was treated as dangerous when women expressed it, creating a world where female passion was equated with madness or immorality. Female desire in ancient Greece was not simply discouraged. It was condemned as a dangerous threat to social order. A woman who expressed longing, who admitted attraction, or who stepped even slightly outside the boundaries of modesty, was quickly labelled as shameless. Writers and thinkers described her as unstable, even insane, claiming that passion in women was a sign of weakness or madness, in contrast to men, who were encouraged to explore and boast of their experiences. Women were told that any sign of hunger for intimacy marked them as dishonourable. Their silence was expected, and their restraint was demanded. Drama reveals this double standard most clearly. Tragedies often featured strong female characters, but their strength almost always led to destruction. Medea, who acted on her desires and her rage, was condemned as monstrous. Phaedra, whose forbidden passion consumed her, was portrayed as diseased in body and mind. These stories served as lessons for the audience, warning that female desire would bring disaster not only to the woman, but to all around her. The stage gave women a voice only to silence them in the end. It is almost comical that male poets filled theatres with warnings about women's passion, while spending their own lives indulging in every form of desire. Literature reshaped the female body into something viewed only through male eyes. Women were described as objects of beauty, vessels of temptation, or symbols of ruin. Their bodies became canvases for male imagination, rather than realities of their own. This perspective erased women's experiences, reducing them to reflections of men's fears and desires. If we compare this to today, it would be like allowing only men to write every movie, every book, and every history, deciding how women look, think, and act, while silencing women's own voices entirely. The condemnation of female desire was rooted in fear of disorder. Greek society placed heavy importance on structure, hierarchy, and control. Male freedom was presented as natural, while female freedom was seen as chaos. A woman who expressed passion threatened the balance of the household and the pride of men. She became a danger because her independence challenged the assumption that men alone controlled intimacy. By labelling women's longing as madness, society kept them powerless. Inside the home, the silence of women was reinforced daily. Wives were not expected to enjoy intimacy, only to provide heirs. Their value was tied to obedience, not affection. Any sign that they might want more, pleasure, freedom, choice was treated as rebellion. Girls grew up surrounded by warnings that desire would destroy them, while boys were raised to celebrate it. The divide was not subtle, it was absolute. Religion also reflected this suspicion of female passion. Goddesses who embodied desire, such as Aphrodite, were admired for beauty but also framed as dangerous, capable of leading men astray. Women were associated with temptation, with weakness, and with ruin. By connecting female desire with threat, religion joined literature and law in maintaining the silence of women. I find it troubling to imagine how many women must have lived their whole lives suppressing their feelings, taught to believe that their very humanity was a form of disorder. This fear of women's desire created a culture where men projected their anxieties onto women's bodies. Women became symbols of what men wished to control, painted as unstable so that control seemed justified. By condemning their passion, society disguised inequality as morality. Women who obeyed the rules were praised as virtuous, while those who strayed were written into stories as warnings. Even in daily interactions, women were judged for the smallest signs. A laugh too loud, an expression of pleasure, or even a lingering glance could spark suspicion. Communities thrived on this surveillance, reinforcing one another's fears. Men felt secure in their liberty because women's restraint was policed by everyone around them. A wife who desired more than silence endangered her household, while a husband who pursued countless affairs remained untarnished. The result was a society where women's humanity was diminished. By denying their ability to feel and to express, Greek culture forced them into roles defined by absence. They were mothers without voices, wives without choice, and figures in stories written by others. Their lives were restricted not only by walls and laws, but by the very definitions of sanity and honour. The tragedy of this system is clear when viewed from today. Female desire is as natural as male desire, yet Greek society treated it as corruption. By silencing women, they silenced half their own humanity. They created stories, laws, and rituals that pretended to protect order while in truth protecting only male privilege. The cost was generations of women erased, their longings unspoken, their stories untold. The condemnation of female passion shows how inequality reached into the most intimate parts of life. From literature to law, women were denied the right to feel openly. What men celebrated as vitality, women endured as accusation. The contrast was stark, and it reinforced the structure of control. The story of women's suppressed desire shows how Greek society equated passion with disorder when it came from women. From here, the extent of violence becomes clearer, where the loss of honour could cost not just reputation but life itself. What began as silence about longing could end in blood, as families acted to preserve pride at any cost. The link between female sexuality and family honour in ancient Greece could reach its darkest point in the form of death. Women who were suspected of tarnishing their family's reputation often found that suspicion itself was enough to seal their fate. Fathers and husbands, claiming to protect dignity, sometimes acted violently when even a rumour of misconduct arose. A girl accused of losing her virginity outside marriage, or a wife accused of infidelity, might be killed without trial or evidence. The act was justified as the defence of honour, and society, far from condemning it, often looked away. In these cases, women were not seen as individuals but as fragile vessels of pride, and once that pride was believed broken, their lives lost all value. The cruelty of this system was that proof was rarely required. A glance, a whisper, or the jealousy of a neighbour could be enough to plant suspicion. For a man, defending his family's name outweighed the life of a wife or daughter. Communities often accepted such violence without question, because the preservation of honour was treated as higher than justice. It is almost grotesque that a culture capable of producing philosophers of reason allowed lives to be ended over rumours and shadows. This contradiction reveals how far inequality extended, turning women into victims of both law and silence. The silence was not passive but active. By refusing to question or intervene, society reinforced the cycle. The death of a woman suspected of dishonour was not seen as murder, but as a correction. Families could claim they had preserved their place in the community, and neighbours chose not to ask questions. This silence made the violence sustainable, repeated from one generation to the next. The absence of outrage was what gave the practice its strength. If we compare this to today, it would be like accepting that a man could kill his daughter simply because of gossip, and then praising him for protecting his family's name rather than punishing him. Plays and myths also reflected this brutal connection between honour and death. Women who defied norms were often killed by husbands, fathers, or gods, reinforcing the message that defiance brought destruction. These stories worked as cultural lessons, reminding audiences that women who stepped outside their assigned roles could expect tragedy. Literature and myth did not invent the violence but legitimized it, making it appear natural and even noble. The household was the stage for this cruelty. A wife's life was bound by obedience, and her survival depended on her husband's trust. A daughter's safety depended on her father's pride. In either case, suspicion could outweigh affection. Families were both protectors and executioners, shaping women's lives with the same hands that might one day take them away. Women had no recourse, no legal protection, and no voice to defend themselves. In a society where public justice ignored women's rights, private punishment filled the gap. A man who killed his wife for suspected adultery could be seen as defending his honor rather than committing a crime. His actions might even earn respect among his peers. The courts rarely interfered because the legal system was built around protecting male dignity, not individual fairness. This gave husbands and fathers the freedom to decide life and death within their households. I find it deeply disturbing that the preservation of reputation was allowed to outweigh human life so completely. The cruelty was compounded by the fact that suspicion alone was enough. Women had no way to prove innocence, because silence was expected of them. Speaking in defense might be seen as further proof of guilt. Their existence was already defined by obedience, so the moment obedience was questioned, they were powerless. A woman's fate lay entirely in the perceptions of men around her, perceptions that could shift with gossip or envy. For the community, these deaths were not anomalies but part of the structure of order. To accept them was to preserve stability. By allowing men to enforce honor with violence, society ensured that women lived in constant fear. This fear reinforced control, discouraging even the smallest steps outside silence. Girls grew up hearing stories of women destroyed by suspicion, and those stories shaped their behavior. Fear became as powerful as law, governing daily life as effectively as any decree. The harsh reality is that these acts were often invisible outside the family. Unlike public executions, honor killings left no record, no outcry, and no challenge. They blended into the rhythm of private life, whispered about but never openly condemned. This invisibility preserved the practice, ensuring that it remained a hidden but enduring feature of Greek society. It was violence disguised as morality, and morality used as justification for violence. When viewed against the backdrop of Greek achievements, this cruelty is even more jarring. The same society that celebrated the pursuit of truth and justice tolerated silent killings within households. Philosophy spoke of virtue. Democracy claimed equality among citizens. Yet half the population was denied the right to live free of fear. The contradiction was visible to anyone who looked closely, yet it was accepted as natural. Over time, this obsession with honor left lasting scars. Women became less than individuals, treated instead as symbols of family pride. Their bodies were possessions, their voices erased, their lives conditional. The system that claimed to defend dignity instead produced cruelty. Families who killed their daughters or wives claimed victory over shame, but what they achieved was silence and loss. The deaths of women in the name of honor show how far inequality could go when left unchallenged. By granting men control over both life and reputation, society allowed injustice to flourish unchecked. Women lived and died not according to their choices but according to suspicion, and suspicion required no proof. The silence of neighbors, the endorsement of tradition, and the blindness of law combined to make this cruelty ordinary. The story of women killed for honor reveals how fragile life was for those denied autonomy. From here, it becomes clearer how society turned female sexuality into property, stripping women of control even over their own existence. What began as surveillance of virginity ended with violence, showing how completely a culture can sacrifice justice when reputation is placed above humanity. In Greece, a woman's body was never considered her own. From childhood, she lived under her father's control, her purity guarded as part of the household's honor. When she was married, her body was transferred like property into the authority of her husband. At no point in her life was she treated as the sole possessor of herself. The shift was seamless, accepted as the natural rhythm of society. A daughter was her father's responsibility until she became her husband's possession, and neither stage allowed her the freedom to decide. Marriage contracts reflected this reality. Fathers negotiated with prospective husbands, treating their daughters as assets. Virginity was discussed as a guarantee, ensuring that inheritance would remain legitimate. A woman's consent was rarely considered. Her presence was symbolic rather than active. She was the subject of arrangements but never the author of them. Her body became the foundation of alliances, a commodity traded to preserve wealth and reputation. It is almost absurd that in a culture that praises reason and justice, a woman's worth could be reduced to the illusion of untouched skin. Inside the household, the same rule continued. The wife was expected to remain faithful, not as a partner, but as a possession that had to be guarded. Her actions reflected not her own dignity, but her husband's pride. If she failed to conform, the dishonor fell on him, and he held the right to punish her. This control was not hidden, nor was it seen as unfair. It was presented as tradition, as a form of order, binding generations to the same pattern. The system was reinforced by law. Women rarely appeared in